Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Lindsay and I'm really pleased to be joining you for this webinar today, and I'll share my screen with you so that we can get started. Oh, my spinning wheel is spinning, so hopefully we'll share the screen. Oh, the host disabled me sharing the screen. I might have to ask Harry to permit me to share my screen. Ah, great, thank you. And it's just thinking for a moment. Let's hope you're all enjoying some good weather where you are. It's been a bit cooler here today. So today we're talking about mark making and how we can use mark making processes to inspire our children's engagement, to empower them, to have them feel a sense of agency when they're making art and playing with art materials, or mark making materials as I like to call them. I think if we get less hung up about making art and focus more on the art materials as a language that children can make marks with, communicate ideas, but also just express movement when they're playing with those mark making tools. I'd like to extend my thanks to that we're all grateful to the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority for making this Parenting in the Pandemic initiative a reality. As I speak, if you think of any questions you'd like to ask and you don't want to forget to hold off to the end, you can put them in the chat in writing, or you can just make a note at your end and then talk to me in person at the end of the presentation after about half an hour. And each time I present, I also give you a handout which will be accessible to you through the website. To begin my presentation, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet, and pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend my respects to any Aboriginal people or First Nations people who are with us today. And I like to ask that we celebrate the earth we live on and always choose kindness and compassion to all people. A little bit of background about myself for those of you who haven't been to any of my previous webinars. I taught and was a director in a preschool or several preschools for more than about 22 years before I was compelled to come to university and do some postgraduate research and completed my doctorate a few years ago. And so now my work for the last 9 or 10 years has been in teaching the early childhood teachers, teaching the next generation of early childhood teachers to hopefully be confident to utilise visual arts practice. I teach lots of other subjects as well, but the visual arts focus is my research and my teaching passion. And now I get to do lots of research with children in Australia and around the world. And I put the little picture down in the bottom of the screen because I think it's important that during this time of social distancing, that we're all exercising our creative languages. So I've been doing some weekly reflections in my visual arts journal. So what we're going to look at today is to review the conditions for creativity and quality art making with children, to think about what's important there. We will dwell on the idea of mark making and why that is helpful for young children to, as I said, get less caught up about product and think more about the process for the children. And how to get past the blank page is a challenge many of us face when we're wanting to do something creative. We almost tie ourselves in knots with worrying about whether it will be appropriate or good enough, or whether it will look like we want it to. And that's no different for children. Often they don't know where to start. So today's workshop really looks at some ways you can start that process with your children, regardless of whether they are typically developing or whether they are children of determination. And I'll share some examples and ideas for some meaningful mark making experiences where your child gets to be the mark maker and the artist, again, rather than having the adult take over and steal away the potential for children's learning. I'd also like, before we really get going, to encourage you that as you make art with your children through the present project, that you'd be taking lots of photos. Obviously photos you're happy to upload to the shared gallery space that'll be available in the future. So details will be provided to you on how to do that. So we'd like to really be celebrating all of the artful expression that is happening as a result of workshops. Sorry, I'm just locating my mouse, which has disappeared so that I can't know how to click to the next slide. I might just completely up here. So, here we go. I think that's what I was after. Yes, still can't see my mouse, but that's fine. So, some conditions for stimulating children's creativity. About the experience children are engaging in. We want it to be a social experience. Children, apologies, that's because of that frozen mouse. Dear, just me, rather than have it playing up. I'll just stop sharing the screen and start sharing it again. It's jamming up on my computer for some reason. Okay, we will share the PowerPoint and we'll hope that things behave themselves. Aren't the joys of technology something to behold? So I'll jump past the slides that we had already covered. So let's think about creativity. We need to make sure that the experience is social and that children can participate fully, that our environment is open-ended. We call that an intelligent environment. That we're using materials that are open-ended, that don't have a set activity associated with them, and that supports children to make of that material or that environmental provision whatever they will make of it, rather than being narrowed into a predetermined outcome. Creativity is supported when we support children to be self-driven in their activity, where the adult is operating as a helper and a facilitator, but is not taking over and making things for children, because that disempowers children, and we want children to be empowered. We need to allow time, because building new knowledge and creating new ideas takes time, and it takes repeated experiences with materials. We can't expect to give children materials just one time and expect that they'll do anything much more than experiment with those materials. We don't develop the skill of a language without many, many opportunities to speak that language. And if we think about art making as a language, or mark making as a language, then the same principle applies, that we need to give children many opportunities to get to know those materials and to work out what they can do. And we need to create special spaces where imagination can flourish. So if your child likes to hide under the table, then let's put the art making experience where they like to be. Or if children love to be in boxes, some of you might have been in my presentation last week, and we were saying if a child likes to be enclosed in a space like a box, then we can put the drawing or the mark making experience inside that inviting special place. We know that quality visual arts experiences require that the adults working with children believe that children are capable. It's coming from a strengths-based approach, where we're respecting the voice of the child. And I don't just mean the voice that they speak with their mouth, with their spoken language. I mean their voice as they express their emotions, their feelings, their body language. All of the things that tell us what your child is thinking. That's what you know how to tap into. But it's sometimes an active choice to remember that we want to view children from a strengths-based position, rather than thinking about all the things they can't do yet. We want to think about what they can do and how we can support them to build and scaffold on what they already can do. To support the child to make meaning. as I said previously, to assist rather than take over and direct, where we're providing quality materials and meaningful processes, where we enter this dialogue with materials as an encounter, as a place for relationships between the child and the materials, but also between yourself and the child. And hopefully also your relationship with the materials is part of that dialogue, because children learn so much when you model behaviours and practices. We want to think about open-ended processes and, most importantly, giving children that time to play and to explore, so that we can adapt creative arts experiences to the capabilities of every child. We want to position you as parents as the expert about your child, to adapt those experiences to suit your child. And I have talked about these ideas in an earlier workshop, but I think we constantly, I know I do as a teacher, need to constantly be reminded to take that strengths-based position. And what encounters might we need to set up for our children so that they can develop a relationship with materials and to be in dialogue together? And I want you to constantly say to yourself, you know, if you're saying, oh, that's not going to work for my child, I want you to challenge yourself to ask, how can I adapt this activity or this experience or this art idea to suit my child? And is there another way I can make it work? So it's that positive approach rather than a deficit approach. I also, before we share some activity and some experience ideas, want to go to one of my favourite philosophers, John Dewey. And he reminds us that the child is our starting point, the centre and the end. The child's development, the child's growth is what we're looking for. We literally have to take our stand with where the child is now and our departure from him or her, from your child's ideas and interests and preferences. Because Dewey reminds us it's the child and not the subject matter or not the activity or not even the art material that determines the quality and the quantity of the learning. So it's your relationship with your child that really matters the most. So let's think about joyful and meaningful mark making. So the team at the other end are going to play this little mark making video. It's only 1 minute and 45 seconds long. Thanks. I'll stop sharing the screen in case that's causing the delay.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. Today we're going to be thinking about drawing and mark making in early childhood settings. From the beginning of human history, people have had the urge to create and make meaning and communicate their ideas using visual media. And it's no different in early childhood settings. Children, when we provide them with materials, quickly discover that they can make a mark and have an effect using materials. And that's a really exciting process to be involved in as an educator. It's actually really important that we know the materials and the methods that we can use to support children to communicate their ideas and to express meaning and make ideas using materials. For young children, making marks can actually be a form of cognition. So as children use materials and express their ideas visually, it can help them to express their thinking visually. And this can be a form of communication even for children who are pre-literate and pre-verbal. As they make marks, they're thinking through their ideas and expressing them using visual media. So as educators, as I said, it's really important to know how to support that process for all children that we work with. For early childhood educators, it's really important that we're familiar with the materials that we use with young children so that we can effectively support them in their processes of meaning making, mark making and expression of their thinking. So I can only encourage you as we go through this video to think through the materials and the processes that can effectively support you to work with young children in their mark making.
Thanks, everybody. I'll just share the PowerPoint with you again and we'll move on. So as you gathered from that, that's a video that I developed for using with my early childhood teachers, but I just thought it would be really helpful for you to consolidate some of the things I'd already spoken about. And of course, everything that I say about an educator applies to you because you are your child's first educator and most important educator. Sometimes we forget that you've been educating your child since before they were born. So choosing materials is what we need to focus on. What will support our children to make a rich and meaningful mark? Now, I'm aware that many of you might not have a full range of art supplies in the home unless you are inclined to be an artist yourself. So I thought that we could think about some of the materials that are really great for making marks that may be found around your home. Pens, biros, pencils, things like laundry markers, you know, the pens that you sort of write on clothing with to label it. They can be bought at the supermarket. Texters and markers. Ink pads, although a lot of people aren't using stamp pads anymore, but they do still exist. You might have them in the bottom of a drawer. Whiteout, so the product that you use for marking, rubbing out mistakes. With a white sort of paint. You might have some leftover water-soluble house paint in your garage if you're a home decorator. You can make marks with tea and coffee. During the pandemic, I did a project with my colleagues where they dribbled some coffee dregs onto the paper to make a brown mark, and then we used a black pen to decorate that blob. We called it coffee splats and squiggles. You might have food colouring in your pantry. If you use that for, you know, colouring the icing on a cake, that can make a great art making, mark making material. And you might even have barbecue charcoal or even burnt wood, which when charcoal is rubbed on paper can make marks as well. So let's watch a video where I demonstrate some of the kinds of mark making that you can do. I do use some additional materials that you might like to shop for online because they make a wonderful mark. So I'll stop sharing the screen again so the team can share the video. What we're going to be looking at in this workshop is thinking about how we can support children not to be so worried about the end product or about doing something correctly. Often when you're looking at a blank piece of paper, it's really difficult just to know where you can even start with mark making. The first thing to do is really just to give children the opportunity to learn about the different mark making tools that you've collected. So what I have for us to look at today is a range of the kinds of things that children can really delight in making marks with. So of course you've got your standard pencil, but I would always go for a better quality pencil, something that's a soft pencil. So when you go shopping for pencils, there'll be pencils that have an H in the title on the side, but they're generally quite hard. So a HB, not too bad, but what you want is a 2B or a 3B or a 4B or even a 6B. Whereas if you get a 2H or a 4H or a 6H, that's getting harder and harder and harder. And so children will find it hard to make a mark. So if you look at a pencil that's nice and soft, then it creates lovely marks on the paper. Another option is to buy some charcoal pencils, which then have a completely different effect. They might break a little easier, as you can see. You can also purchase charcoal in a box. This is willow charcoal, which is less successful for younger children because it can snap if you press too hard. But you can buy thicker, stubbier charcoals that which is called compressed charcoal, which then is much more resilient for children to make marks with. But as you can see, this HB pencil is a much lighter mark. It's still reasonably responsive, but not as good as the really soft pencils. Another material to use with mark making is oil-based crayons, and you can see that without terribly much effort you can get a really nice mark. You can press lightly or you can press hard and get a beautiful black mark, really responsive. And I've picked some greys from the palette as well. Sometimes it's nice to play with monochromatic tones. Here we have some pastels, chalk pastels, similar to charcoal, maybe a little smoother, and can do some really lovely things. And experiment with your children, model and demonstrate, you know, what happens when you rub your hands into the charcoal, or, well, that's crayon, sorry, that's crayon too, into the charcoal, see, because it spreads out. Again, some nice monochromatic pale brown there, which can be quite aesthetically beautiful, rather than just creating a gaudy, multicoloured scribble. We often think children need multicolours, but children respond really well to blacks and whites and greys. Great felt pens, but again, you know, got to look after them because they do dry out. This one has double-ended options, and look how beautiful that black thick line is. So it's just about initially having this relationship with materials. I'll show you one more material that's quite magic, which is India ink. I've mentioned it in previous workshops. I like to apply India ink with a stick rather than with a paintbrush. It's such a dark, rich material that applying it with a paintbrush is a bit risky because you just get too much of it all over the place. Whereas applied with the stick, it can be really, really responsive. So have fun with just making marks initially. Okay, thank you. I'll share the PowerPoint again and we'll move on. So it's about trying to introduce something that will get your children started, because as I said at the beginning, sometimes a blank page can be very overwhelming, not just for children, for ourselves, whereas just starting off with some scribble, you know, up in the top right hand side there, you can see hand tracing where all of the lines have been overlapped, and then, you know, the whole family could do that and colour in the different shapes and forms with different shades of black, grey, white, with whatever materials you have. But it's about warming them up with mark making and getting over that fear of doing the right thing. You know, every mark matters, and it's just really great to be able to celebrate the fun of that without getting caught up and worried about whether it's correct. I mean, the wonderful thing about art is that there is no wrong answer. So long as your child is expressing their ideas and using their body and making marks, then that is success. And it can be beautiful when you're sort of choosing colour palettes or materials that work well together. So have an experiment, play with materials, just do what I did in that previous video, just work out what marks different things make. But you can also draw on photographs. As you can see in the bottom right hand side there, that's with old shirt boxes. They've printed off photos of children onto just A4 paper, you know, enlarge and print on the photocopier, cut it out, glue it in, and then your child can just make marks on their own portrait. That can sometimes be enough to create that invitation for making a mark, and using that combination of photography and mark making as well is lots of fun. And so I'd like to challenge you as a springboard to drawing to think about using the photos you take of whether your children's done some ephemeral art using bottle lids like we were talking about last week, or plants or found materials, as you can see in the photos on the screen. And so these children were making ephemeral artworks out of things we'd collected from the beach. That's beach glass, sea urchins, a piece of palm frond. And when combined into an arrangement and then photographed, it's actually beautiful in its own right. But then what we did was printed those photos out. In the photo you see there, the little girl is actually using the photo over the top of a mono printing experience, which would be a whole other workshop. But for example, you could use the sorts of blacks and whites and greys and pencils and chalk, whiteout and so on, textures, to just colour in the printed photograph, because then it's not a blank white page. It's starting with something the children have already enjoyed and participated in, and it creates a new invitation to a new experience. And so what we're going to look at now is another idea, just a possibility around. Last week we were talking about being inspired by tracing things you find in the kitchen, like plates and cups and colanders and sieves. And so I've taken that idea a step further so that you can create a design using that tracing process. Again, not as scary as telling somebody to draw a picture of something. Instead, it's just enjoying the shapes and the forms and the black lines onto the white paper. You can do that collaboratively. You can hold the object while your child traces. You can model that process, or they might be ready to do it independently. So just take their lead on what's the best approach between the two of you, or the three of you, or the whole family, depending what you're doing. And then in this example that we'll watch in the video, I've suggested that you can use multimedia, whatever you've got in the home. So I use some paint, I use the India ink. Sometimes I paint water before I put the India ink on. The video goes for about 2 minutes. So yeah, I just want to really encourage you to create those open-ended invitations for children that are building on something they've done before. So one day you might just do some tracing, or you might just play with their Lego and take a photo of what they make. But then you can use the photo of that experience to springboard into another. So I hope you enjoy this video. I had fun making it. So I will again stop sharing the screen, and we are almost finish the presentation after that, and we'll have some time for questions as well. Don't mind that there's no sound with this one, it's just a watching one. What you see there is I had done it in pencil first, and then I went over the top with felt pen and then started playing. But now we'll do some mark making play from beginning to end. So tracing all of the kitchen objects, then doing some outlines and picking out the shapes, colouring them in with different types of blacks, whites, greys. Keeping that monochromatic colour just means that the end product will be much more aesthetic. Now, obviously, this is an adult doing this experience. Don't expect your children to end up with something that looks quite like this. But I think it's important for you as an adult to play with process yourself. And play with your child and demonstrate what's possible with them as well, but accept all of their efforts as their efforts, and that they're worthy. You don't need them to do gallery worthy work when they're only children. So I hope you can appreciate that those shapes were really lovely to play with. There was no fear for me. I did this, even though I sped up the video, it only took a couple of minutes from beginning to end, maybe 5 minutes altogether. Obviously, you can take much longer. but it's just about finding some objects, tracing them, marking some shapes. Make sure you overlap the shapes, because then you get some really interesting results. So I will share the screen and we will finish off despite our glitches. Oh, well, in fact, that was it. So do we have any questions? I will stop sharing. I'll just check. Did I have something at the end? Oh, that's just some backup questions. So I'll stop sharing and we'll see if anyone had some original questions before I potentially talk to the hypotheticals that I'm sometimes presented with. So you can either pop them in the chat or you can disable your microphone and speak up. Maybe. If anyone's not brave enough to speak out, feel free to type a question in the chat and the team at Bright Start will help me to moderate that. But in the meantime, I guess I'll share the screen and just address some of the questions that often arise. So question 1, I don't have those materials. Will the processes still be valuable if I use the pens, pencils that you do have? Yes, of course, the experience will still be valuable, because if you think back to some of the core messages in today's workshop, it's about your relationship with your child, and the only goal is to encourage them to be making marks and to start trusting their ability to take a material and experiment with it, rather than getting caught up with end products. I know I showed you a beginning to end example in that last video, but that's just to show you what the longer term possibilities might be around taking a blank page and taking it somewhere. So anything you can think of to experiment with mark making will be a really important process. And it's actually a scientific process. You know, sometimes people position art as, you know, not terribly academic. You know, people don't always think of art as an academic process, but art actually ties together language, numeracy, science, technology, engineering. It fosters those dispositions for learning and experimenting. So thank you from I can't say your name properly, Tavaziva. What can I do to motivate a child if they're trying to eat the material and they're not interested in mark making? That's a really, really good question, and a really common question, because sometimes children are just putting the materials in their mouth without knowing your child or what their ability or their disability is, or whether it's they're putting things in their mouth because that's developmentally appropriate because they're very young. I mean, you feel free to pop in the chat if you want me to know the details. But I would just really encourage you to provide those opportunities. Choose materials that won't matter if they do pop them in their mouth. So I wouldn't go with India ink if they're likely to suck on it, because it'll get everywhere and they'll have black teeth for quite some time. But things like chalk are not toxic. Things like charcoal are not toxic. So you're wanting to choose things that won't be a problem if they do put them in their mouth. If they're not ready to go in, have that process of, you know, because even the process of drawing is quite complex, because you have to have some form of grasp to be able to pick up the object. Having said that, you can modify an experience. So in previous workshops, I've showed examples. For example, you could drop ink into water. Drops of ink into water, and that your child's whole focus might be less about mark making and more about wondering. So it's just about providing those opportunities for wonder and exploration and supporting focus. Having said that, if you can get your hands on some compressed charcoal, the big, thick, stubby charcoals that I told you about in the video, I have not met a child yet with disabilities or typically developing who are not mesmerised with charcoal. So in previous workshops, I've shown some documentation from when I was teaching where children got charcoal all over their hands, and then they were just rubbing the blackness off their hands onto the paper. So even if they're not able to grasp the charcoal themselves, you can rub the charcoal on your hand and then rub it on the paper, and then offer to rub it on their hand and rub it on the paper. So it's just, as I said earlier, it's about the fact that you are the expert around what your child is interested in, ready to do. And the notion of, a theorist called Vygotsky talks about this. He calls it the zone of proximal development. And this theory has proven that children are capable of more when they're in a relationship with somebody else who just nudges them to the next step in what they can do. So by either observing somebody who's doing it next to them, that can sometimes take them to that next level of being interested or trying something out. Or it's just being able to read when they're just almost ready, and your participation with them can support, and that's why it's called proximal development, that you can do better in relationship with somebody else who's slightly that one step ahead of you than you can on your own. And I think that's really encouraging for parents of children of determination, because I love that you call children with disabilities children of determination, because I think it goes to that image of a capable child, of a child who is ready to learn, who is interested in what's going on around them. Now, of course, because of the disability some children might have, there'll be differing variations to that, but it's about us meeting our children where they are, rather than having an image in our head of where we think they should be, because everyone is individual and we need to meet our children where they're at if we're going to succeed in supporting them to move along in their learning. And that's similar to question 2. Does it matter if my child just scribbles? You know, so if you print a photo, does it matter if they scribble all over it? No, because that's the experience. It's just about them having the power that comes with making their mark. It's not your mark. It's not something that you're trying to frame and put on the wall. It's celebrating the action and the process. Now, are there any other personal questions before I continue with the others? I'm assuming they'll pop up if oh, maybe there is another one there. Hang on, let me just see in the chat. Thank you, from Zalish. I want to ask about kitchen materials that you talk about before, how we can use, I mean, how can we explain to small children? Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way of explaining it to your children is to take them into the kitchen and let them explore in the drawers, in the cupboards, and ask them to find the shapes they like the best. And then you can use those shapes to stimulate the drawing experience or the tracing experience. And I want you, when you're doing that, you should position yourself as being an explorer with your child. You can almost play with them by saying things like, oh, what can we find in the cupboards? Let's go and have a look at what we could find to trace. Or you might have some objects and start tracing, and then you could invite your child, oh, do you want to come and find some shapes that you can trace? So and then you can, as you're demonstrating or suggesting, then you can be saying things like, oh, what happens if we do this? Or do you want me to hold it for you while you mark around the edge? So you're really doing what Vygotsky and a guy called Brunner, a theorist called Brunner, talk about as scaffolding. You're scaffolding the experience, and you're thinking about what's coming next, what support might my child need to have. But rather than jumping in and taking over, you're empowering your child by letting them take the lead, by asking them questions, by making suggestions. And you'll find that in that playful to and fro relationship with your child, you'll have much more success than if you are giving them instructions. As soon as the pressure is on and the instructions are flying, your child feels like you used to feel when somebody sat you down to do an exam. And often when people are sat down to do an exam and get the right answer, it shuts down all creativity. It ramps up the anxiety about getting it right. So we've got to get past this idea that we're testing our children or that they have to perform a certain way for us to be satisfied. And believe you me, children know if they are not meeting with your approval. So you need to put aside, and I don't know you all personally, but just from experience, it's really important that adults put aside their desires and their wishes for their children and just meet your child where they're at and give them those co-learning, co-playing experiences with you. And that is going to be their most valuable, precious experience because you're involved and you're approving and supporting and listening, as I said earlier, not just to their voice, but you're listening with your eyes. You're listening, to see what their movements tell you, what their actions tell you, what their desires are, what they're interested in. And then that's what you build on each time you have an arts experience with your child. Well, thank you. I have another question, I think. How can I make my child stay at a long time doing the tracing and holding a pen? If she doesn't have an interest in it, don't expect it to happen for a long time. If she doesn't have to do the tracing yet, if she's not up to that, then just do the scribbling. And it's not just scribbling. I think a lot of parents, a lot of adults, even a lot of teachers sort of think badly about scribbling. And yet scribbling, the capacity to hold something and make that mark and wonder what will happen if you roll the chalk or roll the charcoal, or what happens if you, instead of holding the crayon, like that, what if happens if you put it on the table and roll it on the paper? So there's all of that exploration. So don't be anxious if the experience only lasts for a few seconds and your child goes and plays with something else. Like I said before, sometimes it takes time to have that relationship with materials, and you might put it out and that's all that happens that day is just the experimentation. We need to experiment with a material and see what it does before we can be expected to create an artwork using that material. A question I am asked a lot of times, how's our time going, team? Oh, we've already answered the one about eating the materials. Yeah. Let me just check our time. Okay, we still have a couple more minutes. If there's no live questions, I can deal with these. Number 3, if you're not confident with art yourself, does that matter? And I guess that's why I shared the video demonstration of how I took a blank piece of paper using tracing, colouring it in with the different materials and paints and so on, to really demonstrate to you that you can play. You can go back to that exploration yourself, because it doesn't matter if you're not confident right now, but sometimes that lack of confidence comes from poorly placed expectations about what is art. So a lot of people label themselves as not being creative or artistic because they can't draw to look like a photo, can't draw realistically, or when they try to draw a horse, it doesn't look like a photographic horse, or if they try to draw a person, it looks like a stick person. So I want you to, for your children's sake, but also for yourself, I want you to move away from feeling like the product has to be something that could hang on a gallery wall. For me, and for children, art is the experience. And that's what Dewey talked about. He said, art as experience, not art as product. Ah, lovely. A question. Do we always have to ask the child to describe his or her art, even the scribbles they have made? No, no. Unless they want to talk about it, there's no need for it to be something that, again, you force them to discuss. Because again, that kind of turns it into a test that they are either going to pass or fail or get right, or what they fear is that they'll get it wrong. And I don't know about you, but sometimes if I'm put on the spot, I freeze up and I just don't know what to say. And children are no different. So no, you don't have to get them to always describe it, but you can ask open-ended questions that if they want to talk about it, they can. But you don't want to ask questions that say, what is it? And you certainly don't want to make statements like, oh, I love that. It looks like a flower, or it looks like a truck, because then if it's not what they intended, they will be really mortified and upset by that. And they'll probably think, well, if she can't even see what it is, what am I doing here? So what's really helpful for children is that you comment not upon what they've drawn so much, but upon the efforts they've been making, because that will encourage them to do it again. When they see you praising them for trying really hard, then that's what will motivate them to do it again with you the next day. So yeah, try and say things like, I can see you're working really hard there, or goodness me, you're pressing hard. I like it. Or, oh, you're using a really soft pencil there. How did you do that? And then they might talk to you to demonstrate how they did that. Or you can wonder, you can ask questions and say, I'm doing it this way, but what happens if you do it, using the crayon this way or the pencil that way? And so you can model that discussion and that conversation. I don't think we have time to get into the what's wrong with stencils and colouring books. That's a really big question. So let me just see how our time is going. If the Bright Start team need to tell me to stop or to keep going, I'm just checking my time. 4:55, so we have about 5 more minutes. Let me just see I won't go to the colouring in books question, except to say that unfortunately when children are given templates or colouring in, sometimes those images straight away make children afraid to make their own marks, because they see that as the example of, say if it's a drawing of a clown or, I don't know, a lion. But if it's like a cartoon lion, children just get afraid then to draw their own interpretation of lion. So that's the problem with stencils and colouring in books. A lot of people love them, and I loved them as a child, and they can have their place, but most children just want to scribble on them. And it's not just scribble, but if you're going to scribble, you might as well make your own mark on a blank page rather than be putting it over the top of somebody else's drawing, which is really what colouring in books are. They're like an adult drawing of something. Sometimes though, and I don't know if I highlighted that earlier, when I was saying about making marks on paper, you don't have to start with a white piece of paper either. Like the tracing idea was a way of getting rid of the scariness of the white, but you can draw on magazine paper, on printed paper, on architect's paper is really lovely paper to draw on newspaper, if you still buy newspapers. So you can experiment with drawing on different things, or on the inside of cereal boxes. I love drawing on the inside of cereal boxes because it's a really lovely texture and takes marks very, very well. So there's something that you should all have at home, even if you don't have high quality paper. The inside of a cereal box is a really wonderful surface to draw on. So I'm afraid I might stop there, and just let me check the Q&A in case they're different questions. No, they're the ones that I addressed. Super. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for putting up with the little glitch. I'm just not sure whether it was my end or whether it was the internet, but something was not happy with me pressing buttons. And it's been lovely to work with you, to share some ideas with you. And I hope if you take nothing else away from today's workshop, I want you to remember to celebrate your child, and to celebrate the fact that you're their first teacher, you are their first educator, you know them better than anybody else does. And just enjoy making marks together. Please take photos of your play with mark making, and they can be uploaded into the gallery. So anything you upload into the Bright Start gallery does not have to be an end product, does not have to be something you would hang on a gallery wall. What we really want, it can be those things if that's where your child goes, but please don't put pressure on them to do something that they're not ready to do. I'd much rather see a photograph of beautiful, dirty, black hands on the paper in the process of this exploration than worrying about what the artwork looks like. So, you know, the joy is in the work of the art, not necessarily in the final product. So I hope you've hope that's given some food for thought. You can certainly learn more. Click on all the links in the handout that I've provided. And I think my blog is also a link on the handouts. I'm also happy if anyone thinks of a question later to ask me. I will pop in the chat my work email. Sorry, not my personal one. And yeah, I'm more than happy to answer any questions if something comes up and you think you'd like to ask somebody who's done, you know, I don't have all the answers. I'm the mum of 2 adult children, and I've been a preschool teacher for a long time, and I've done lots of research in recent years, but I'm still learning. And but if I can help you along in your journey and in your thinking and in creating wonderful play with art and mark making with your children, then that's what I'm here to do. So have a lovely rest of the day in Abu Dhabi or wherever you are located, and I shall go and pack up for the day because it's the end of my day. Okay, thanks everybody.